Hi guys, welcome back to the Law of One Raw Material. This is book 4 and part 3. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, this is probably the most intense and complex session they've ever had with Raw. So you might want to actually just jump ahead, listen to the session, and then come back to the intro for my take on it and definitions, and then listen to the session again because it's pretty intense. And especially the way Raw talks and the words that he uses have so much meaning in them and they go pretty fast. So let's start with some definitions first. The matrix. When we hear the word matrix, we always think of the movie, but when Ra uses it, the matrix is like somewhere where something happens. When he talks about the matrix of the mind, the matrix of the body, and the matrix of the spirit, that is the matrix where something happens. So if something happens in your mind, that's the place, the matrix where you're thinking of something. If the matrix of the body, something's happening in your body, say your heart is beating really fast, or maybe you have cancer or something like that. It's the place where something's happening in your body. And the matrix of spirit is the place where something is happening in source energy. So when he uses matrix, think of it as the place where something is happening. Next is the potentiator, and that is something that causes something else. When something has potential, right? So anything that has the potential to cause something else is the potentiator, and it can really just be absolutely anything. And catalyst for change. When he uses catalyst of the mind, body, and spirit, that's where something can change. And I'd say it's something more intense when there's a catalyst. For example, if you get into drinking and driving accident, that would be the catalyst for you to stop drinking, right? The catalyst is something that causes something else. And then he uses the word significator. Significator is basically you as the all-encompassing thing that is posing for something else. So the significator in tarot is the person that's asking the question. So it's I don't want to say person because the significator could be other things, but mostly when Ra is talking about the significator, it's after everything is all encompassing, like something that is significant would be you asking a question is the significator. And I hope that kind of makes sense. They talk about the veil a lot. And I just want to remind people of the veil. Like there is different aspects to the veil. And when Ra talks about it, there's first the veil of forgetting. When we incarnate into this life, into 3D, we are on one side of the veil. So we don't remember all of our past lives. We don't remember source. We don't really remember anything. And the veil is incredibly intense in 3D. There's also the veil that they talk about between the mind and the body. So the conscience and subconscious of the mind and the body. So like, for instance, our digestive system is working subconsciously of our mind. It's beyond the veil. Because when we get into fourth and fifth densities, we'll be able to lift the veil between the mind and the body and actually communicate more with our body. Say, like if we do have something going on, say we want to heal something within our body, we'll be able to communicate directly with it. Say we have an infection in our body and our infection is festering. Well, that's like a second density festering when we're thinking about the bacteria, and it's in our body, and it's kind of, think of it as being separate from us because there's a veil there between second and third density. But when the veil gets lifted, we'll be able to communicate with that infection and that second density entity and be able to heal ourselves in that way. So that's a really important part of the veil between the conscious and subconscious. So now that we've got those very, very important definitions out of the way, I just want to remind people of the distortion that Ra talks about. There's always the first distortion, second, and third. Now, the first distortion in source energy, the first thing that distorted consciousness was free will. Now think about it. Source energy had the free will to expand, and that was like the first thing that ever happened. So that's the first distortion. The second distortion was love. So as soon as the universe, as soon as consciousness, as soon as the first thing that happened ever expanded, well, then you felt the kind of like the distance between that expansion. So when it oscillated between the two, it was a feeling of love, right? Like coming together almost, and feeling an expansion and coming in again. And it was love is the second distortion. And the third distortion in the law of one is light. It was the distortion of love that created light. Okay, and so these are the three distortions from the law of one that I just want to go over because it does come up over and over again, and because this session actually goes very quickly, it could be hard to catch up and keep up on without a refresher kind of on some of these definitions. And I think my intro to this session is probably going to be longer than the session itself, but I'm hoping that this really helps you to understand what happens and what Ra talks about in this session, because the questioners are really wanting to know about what happened in the octave before this one. Like what happened in the universe before the universe we're experiencing right now? What happened in the previous one, and how did it organize itself? What was the significators and what was the archetypes that happened in the universe before us? And questioners, like, we're assuming that the universe before this one had to be somewhat more simpler, and there had to be less archetypes in the universe before. And it was. The polarity wasn't there. There was no polarity between service to self and service to others. That was something that was learned before this universe was created as a potential to expand and for the universe to know itself better. But in the octaves before this one, that didn't exist, right? It was only service to others. There was no amount of polarity and separatism that happened in 3D for us to make that choice. So it was very different, the universe before this one. And that's what the questioners are really asking Ra about, trying to get their head around about how the universe before this one functioned, before it gave birth to this one. And it's them wanting to understand it. And Ra said there were similarities, like there was reincarnation within 3D to give us experience, but there was no choice being made at the end of it. There was only service to others. And each lifetime, he said, lasted about a millennia. So 1,000 years. The lifetimes were a lot longer. And during that octave, that's when we had the veil of forgetting, and it was kind of like the tool that was used for expansion and being able to attain more experience, to be able to graduate through the densities. Then they really kind of get into the tarot. And remember, the tarot is the archetypes of the soul's journey for experience as we ascend through the dimensions and through the densities. So the first archetype, and we're only talking about the archetypes of the mind in this session. And the first archetype is the matrix of the mind, the magician. And in the tarot, the magician is the beginning. It's the number 1 card in the major arcana. And it's the magician is like the activator, you know, when you manifest something for the first time, when you begin your manifestation. That's the magician. The second one is the potentiator of the mind, you know. So the magician is the matrix of the mind, like the place. And the potentiator is what are you going to do in that place? And that's the high priestess. And the high priestess in the tarot is this vastness of knowledge. You can do and be anything and know anything, like the world is your oyster type of thing. Ra says it's more like the ocean of experience that you can just dip into. And I actually really loved that line that Ra said as a tarot reader to explain what the high priestess is in the tarot. I actually just love that. The catalyst of the mind was the empress. Emperor was the experience, and think about an old emperor that's sitting on the throne that has seen so many wars and has built up his empire and knows every facet of his country. Think of that as the emperor, a very experienced character. And that's what it is in the tarot. The Hierophant, there was a little bit of, distortion, I guess, of the Hierophant when they were trying to explain it because a mistake was made. But the Hierophant is the significator of the mind. And in tarot, the Hierophant is kind of all encompassing of all those experiences. The Hierophant is a very significant character, you can say, right? And another archetype is the lover, which is very transformative. And the lover in the tarot, you can almost compare it to making that choice at the end of 3D, whether you want to be service to others or service to self. But that was not yet an archetype in the octave before us, in the universe before us. And then they have the Chariot. The Chariot is the creative way of the mind, is the archetype. And you can almost say that as the ascension into 4D after you've made that choice, is the Chariot. And in the tarot, the Chariot is movement, it is ascension. And that's the archetype of the mind in this session. And one more thing that they do talk about in this session is almost magical communication when you're in 4 and 5D. And that basically is talked about what I touched on before. When you are able to communicate safe with your mind and your body, when you no longer have that veil between your conscious and subconscious and your body, like when you can communicate with second density, so you have a parasite in your body. And if you were able to communicate with that parasite, say, hey, you got to leave. You're not helping me here. You're hurting me. And I would like you to leave. And to say that parasite just disappears or leaves or, however else it gets out of you, that would seem magical, right? For someone to be able to do that. And that's kind of what they're touching on a little bit about when we're in 4 and 5D of the magical aspect. Because when Ra uses the word magical, it has a very kind of different meaning. It's very purposeful meaning when Ra talks about it. So guys, I really hope that my definitions and explanation help you get through this session. And I promise the rest of book 4 is not this intense as this session, but it does really lay out some awesome foundation for the tarot and how Ra used it and the soul's journey through this universe and the background for how the archetypes and the tarot could be used on how to understand the universe before us. Like really does give you a good foundation for your understanding of the law of one and your ascension and awakening process. So thank you so much, guys, for being here. Here is Book 4, Part 3 of Law of One Raw Material.
The Law of One, Book 4, Session 79, February 24th, 1982. Ra, I am Ra. I greet you in the love and in the light of the one infinite creator. We communicate now. Questioner, could you first give me the condition of the instrument? Ra, I am Ra. It is as previously stated. Questioner, the instrument would like to ask if there is any danger in the instrument receiving too much transferred energy in her present condition. Ra, I am Ra. No. Questioner, she would like to know the function of the energy transferred during the session? Ra, I am Ra. The function of this energy transfer is a most helpful one in that it serves to strengthen the shuttle through which the in-streaming contact is received. The contact itself will monitor the condition of the instrument and cease communication when the distortions of the instrument begin to fluctuate towards the distortions of weakness or pain. However, while the contact is ongoing, the strength of the channel through which this contact flows may be aided by the energy transfer of which you spoke. Questioner, we have been ending our banishing ritual prior to the session by a gesture that relieves us of the magical personality. I was just wondering if we should maintain this personality and omit that gesture while we are walking the circle of one and then relinquish the magical personality only after the circle is formed or after the session. Which would be more appropriate? Ra, I am Ra. The practice of magical workings demands the most rigorous honesty. If your estimate of your ability is that you can sustain the magical personality throughout this working, it is well. As long as you have some doubt, it is inadvisable. In any case, it is appropriate for this instrument to return its magical personality rather than carry this persona into the trance state. For it does not have the requisite magical skill to function in this circumstance, and would be far more vulnerable than if the waking personality is offered as channel. This working is indeed magical in nature in the basic sense. However, it is inappropriate to move more quickly than one's feet may walk. Questioner: I would like to question about the third density experience of those entities just prior to the original extension of the first distortion to the sublogoi to create the split of polarity. Can you describe, in general, the differences between the third density experience of these mind-body spirits and the ones who have evolved upon this planet now? Ra: I am Ra. This material has been previously covered. Please query for specific interest. Questioner: specifically, in the experience where only the service to others polarity in third density evolved, was the veil that was drawn with respect to knowledge of previous incarnations, etc., in effect for those entities? Ra: I am Ra. No. Questioner: was the reincarnational process like the one that we experience here, in which the third density body is entered and exited numerous times during the cycle? Ra: I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: is it possible to give a time of incarnation with respect to our years, and would you do so if it is? Ra: I am Ra. The optimal incarnative period is somewhere close to a measure you call a millennium. This is, as you may say, a constant regardless of other factors of the third density experience. Questioner: then prior to the first extension of the first distortion, the veil or loss of awareness did not occur. From this I will make the assumption that this veil, or loss of remembering consciously that which occurred before the incarnation was the primary tool for extending the first distortion. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. Your correctness is limited. This was the first tool. Questioner: then from that statement I assume that the Logos first devised the tool of separating the unconscious from the conscious during what we call physical incarnations, to achieve its objective? Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. Yes. Questioner: then from that statement I would also assume that many other tools were conceived and used after the first tool of the so-called veil. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. There have been refinements. Questioner: the archetypical mind of the Logos prior to this experiment in veiling was what I would consider to be less complex than it is now, possibly containing fewer archetypes. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. We must ask your patience. We perceive a sudden flare of the distortion known as pain in this instrument's left arm and manual appendages. Please do not touch this instrument. We shall examine the mind complex and attempt to reposition the limb so that the working may continue. Then please repeat the query. I am Ra. You may proceed. Questioner: thank you. Prior to the experiment to extend the first distortion, how many archetypes were there at that time? Ra: I am Ra. There were 9. Questioner: I will guess that those 9 were 3 of mind, 3 of body, and 3 of spirit. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: I am going to guess that in the system of the tarot those archetypes would roughly correspond to, for the mind, the magician, the emperor, and the chariot. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is incorrect. Questioner: could you tell me what they correspond to? Ra: I am Ra. The body, the mind, and the spirit each contained and functioned under the aegis of the matrix, the potentiator, and the significator. The significator of the mind, body, and spirit is not identical to the significator of the mind, body, and spirit complexes. Questioner: I now understand what you meant in the previous session by saying that to extend free will the significator must become a complex. It seems that the significator has become the complex that is the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th of the mind, the 10th on of the body, and the 17th on of the spirit. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is incorrect. Questioner: Could you tell me what you mean by, the significator must become a complex? Ra, I am Ra. To be complex is to consist of more than one characteristic element or concept. Questioner. I would like to try to understand the archetypes of the mind of this logos prior to the extension of the first distortion. In order to better understand that which we experience now, I believe that this is a logical approach. We have, as you have stated, the matrix, the potentiator, and the significator. I understand the matrix as being that which is what we call the conscious mind, but since it is also that from which the mind is made, I am at a loss to fully understand these three terms, especially with respect to the time before there was a division in consciousness. Could you expand even more upon the matrix of the mind, the potentiator of the mind, and the significator of the mind, how they differ, and what their relationships are, please? Ra, I am Ra. The matrix of mind is that from which all comes. It is unmoving yet is the activator and potentiation of all mind activity. The potentiator of the mind is that great resource which may be seen as the sea into which the consciousness dips, ever deeper and more thoroughly in order to create, ideate, and become more self-conscious. The significator of each mind, body, and spirit may be seen as a simple and unified concept. The matrix of the body may be seen to be a reflection and opposites of the mind, that is, unrestricted motion. The potentiator of the body then is that which, being informed, regulates activity. The matrix of the spirit is difficult to characterize since the nature of spirit is less modal. The energies and movements of the spirit are, by far, the most profound yet, having more close association with time-space, do not have the characteristics of dynamic motion. Thusly one may see the matrix as the deepest darkness and the potentiator of spirit as the most sudden awakening, illuminating, and generative influence. This is the description of archetypes 1 through 9 before the onset of influence of the co-creator, or sublogos realization of free will. Questioner. The first change made then for this extension of free will was to make the communication between the matrix and the potentiator of the mind relatively unavailable one to the other during the incarnation. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. We would perhaps rather term the condition as relatively more mystery-filled than relatively unavailable. Questioner. The idea was then to create some type of veil between the matrix and the potentiator of the mind. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner. This veil then occurs between what we now call the unconscious and conscious minds. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner. It was probably the design of the logos to allow the conscious mind greater freedom under the first distortion by partitioning, you might say, this from the potentiator or unconscious, which had a greater communication with the total mind, therefore, allowing for the birth of uneducated. To use a poor term, portions of consciousness. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is roughly correct. Questioner. Could you de-roughen it or elucidate a bit on that? Ra, I am Ra. There is intervening material before we may do so. Questioner. Okay. Was then this simple experiment carried out and the product of this experiment observed before greater complexity was attempted? Ra, I am Ra. As we have said, there have been a great number of successive experiments. Questioner. I was just wondering, since this seems to be the crux of the experiment, the large breaking point between no extension of the first distortion and the extension of the first distortion, what the result of this original experiment was with respect to that which was created from it. What was the result of that? Ra, I am Ra. This is previously covered material. The result of these experiments has been a more vivid, varied, and intense experience of creator by creator. Questioner. Well, I was aware of that. I probably didn't state the question correctly. It's a very difficult question to state. I don't know if it's worth attempting to continue with, but what I meant was, when this very first experiment with the veiling process occurred, did it result in service to self-polarization with the first experiment? Ra, I am Ra. The early, if we may use this term, logoi produced service to self and service to others, mind-body-spirit complexes immediately. The harvestability of these entities was not so immediate, and thus refinements of the archetypes began apace. Questioner, now we are getting to what I was trying to determine. Then at this point, were there still only 9 archetypes and the veil had just been drawn between the matrix and the potentiator of the mind? Ra, I am Ra. There were 9 archetypes and many shadows. Questioner, by shadows do you mean what I might refer to as, birthing of small archetypical biases? Ra, I am Ra. Rather we would describe these shadows as the inchoate thoughts of helpful structures not yet fully conceived. Questioner, would the choice exist at this point during the creation of the first service to self polarity? Ra, I am Ra. Implicit in the veiling or separation of 2 archetypes is the concept of choice. The refinements to this concept took many experiences. Questioner, I'm sorry that I have so much difficulty in asking these questions, but this is material that I find somewhat difficult. I find it interesting that the very first experiment of veiling the matrix of the mind from the potentiator of the mind and vice versa created service to self polarity. This seems to be a very important philosophical point in the development of the creation, and possibly the beginning of a system of what we would call magic not envisioned previously. Let me ask this question. Prior to the extension of the first distortion, was the magical potential of the higher densities as great as it is now when the greatest potential was achieved in consciousness for each density? This is difficult to ask. What I am asking is that at the end of 4th density, prior to the extension of free will, was what we call magical potential as great as it is now at the end of 4th density? Ra, I am Ra. As you understand, if we may use this misnomer, magic, the magical potential in 3rd and 4th density was then far greater than after the change. However, there was far less desire or will to use this potential. Questioner, now, to be sure that I understand you, prior to the change and the extension of free will, let's take specifically the end of 4th density. Magical potential for the condition when there was only service to others polarization was much greater at the end of 4th density than at the end of 4th density immediately after the split of polarization and the extension of free will. Is that correct? Ra, I am Ra. Magical ability is the ability to consciously use the so-called unconscious. Therefore, there was maximal ability prior to the innovation of sublogoi's free will. Questioner, okay. At the present time we are experiencing the effects of a more complex or greater number of archetypes, and I have guessed that the ones we are experiencing now in the mind are as follows. We have the magician and high priestess, which correspond to the matrix and potentiator with the veil drawn between them, which is the primary creator of the extension of the first distortion. Is that correct? Ra, I am Ra. We are unable to answer this query without intervening material. Questioner, okay. Sorry about that. The next archetype, the Empress, is the catalyst of the mind, that which acts upon the conscious mind to change it. The 4th archetype is the Emperor, the experience of the mind, which is that material stored in the unconscious, which creates its continuing bias. Am I correct with those statements? Ra, I am Ra. Though far too rigid in your statements, you perceive correct relationships. There is a great deal of dynamic interrelationship in these first 4 archetypes. Questioner, would the Hierophant then be somewhat of a governor or sorter of these effects so as to create the proper assimilation by the unconscious of that which comes through the conscious? Ra, I am Ra. Although thoughtful, the supposition is incorrect in its heart. Questioner, what would be the Hierophant? Ra, I am Ra. The Hierophant is the significator of the body complex, its very nature. We may note that the characteristics of which you speak do have bearing upon the significator of the mind complex, but are not the heart. The heart of the mind complex is that dynamic entity which absorbs, seeks, and attempts to learn. Questioner, then is the Hierophant that link, you might say, between the mind and the body? Ra, I am Ra. There is a strong relationship between the significators of the mind, the body, and the spirit. Your statement is too broad. Questioner, let me skip over the Hierophant for a minute because I am really not understanding that at all and just ask if the lovers represent a merging of the conscious and the unconscious or the communication of the conscious and unconscious. Ra corrected this error in session number 80. The Hierophant is the significator of the mind. Ra, I am Ra. Again, without being at all unperceptive, you miss the heart of this particular archetype, which may be more properly called the transformation of the mind. Questioner, transformation of the mind into what? Ra, I am Ra. As you observe archetype 6, you may see the student of the mysteries being transformed by the need to choose betwixt the light and the dark in mind. Questioner, would the conqueror or chariot then represent the culmination of the action of the first 6 archetypes into a conquering of the mental processes, even possibly removing the veil? Ra, I am Ra. This is most perceptive. The archetype 7 is one difficult to enunciate. We may call it the path, the way, or the great way of the mind. Its foundation is a reflection and substantial summary of archetypes 1 through 6. One may also see the way of the mind as showing the kingdom or fruits of appropriate travel through the mind, and that the mind continues to move as majestically through the material it conceives of as a chariot drawn by royal lions or steeds. At this time we would suggest one more full query, for this instrument is experiencing some distortions towards pain. Questioner, then I will just ask about the one of the archetypes which I am the least able to understand at this point, if I can use that word at all. I am still very much in the dark, so to speak, in respect to the Hierophant and precisely what it is. Could you give me some other indication of what that is? Ra, I am Ra. You have been most interested in the significator, which must needs become complex. The Hierophant is the original archetype of mind, which has been made complex through the subtle movements of the conscious and unconscious. The complexities of mind were evolved rather than the simple melding of experience from potentiator to matrix. The mind itself became an actor possessed of free will and, more especially, will. As the significator of the mind, the Hierophant has the will to know, but what shall it do with its knowledge? And for what reasons does it seek? The potentials of a complex significator are manifold. Are there any brief queries at this working? Questioner, only is there anything that we can do to make the instrument more comfortable or to improve the contact? Ra, I am Ra. All is well. For some small portion of your future the instrument would be well advised to wear upon the hands those aids to comfort, which it has neglected to use. There has been some trauma to both hands and arms and, therefore, we have had to somewhat abbreviate this working. I am Ra. You are conscientious, my friends. We leave you in the love and in the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one glorious infinite Creator. Adonai.